This is lesson 2 of unit 1, misleading graphs. What are misleading graphs? It's when the data in a graph is presented in a misleading way, so inaccurate observations are drawn. Something is slightly altered about how the graph is made so that visually it looks a little bit different and tells a slightly different story than what the truth might actually be. Sometimes this is done on purpose, sometimes it's done by accident. Those that do it on purpose are purposely trying to mislead the person looking at the graph. So they might be trying to manipulate results or manipulate data. And you should watch for this in media. But sometimes it also can be done by accident if the creator is misinformed or if they're not careful. So it's also another reason why it's important to be able to spot misleading graphs so that you don't create misleading graphs for anyone else. This is a short TED Talk that shows you how you can spot a misleading graph. I'm not going to play it now, but you can watch it on your own time. So example 1, why is this graph misleading? It looks like there's a pretty large increase. This is representing average weekly earnings of Canadians. It looks like there's a pretty large increase from the beginning of the graph, 1997, to the end of the graph at 2008. But if we look closely at the vertical axis, you see that the scale doesn't start at 0. And that's something that we learned in the first lesson, is that the scale always has to start at 0. This one starts at 600. So this is actually a very zoomed in version of this data. So why is it misleading? Because the scale doesn't start at 0. It looks like a pretty large increase has occurred because when you visually look at the graph, it's shooting upwards. But if you actually look at the numbers on the side, it's going from 720 to like 780 maybe even less. So there's really not a big increase in the dollar amount from 1997 to 2008, but because of how it's presented visually, because the person who made this altered the scale, it makes it look like the increase is actually a lot larger. It's like they zoomed in to make that small increase seem big. So how can you fix misleading graphs? What would this look like if it was an accurate graph? This is what it would look like, which is almost a straight line. There's very little increase. So the only difference between this graph and the one on the other slide is that this scale starts at 0. Once you correct that and make this graph correctly, you'll see that the weekly earnings of Canadians it's almost not changed at all since from 1997 to 2008. So that first graph is misleading because it makes it look like the earnings have gone up. Here's example 2. Why is this graph considered misleading? So this is, what is this comparing? Percents of students graduating for 3 different schools, and it's comparing both boys and girls. So this is a double bar graph, and it's comparing different schools. So at first glance, it looks like school B is doing really well because it has the highest bars. So that must mean that the highest percent of students are graduating. And it's almost double the height of school A. So maybe you might draw a conclusion that school B is twice as good as school A because those bars are twice as high. But if you look closely again at the scale on the vertical axis, you'll see that weird squiggly line. And what does that mean? Well, it's saying from the first line to the second line, that's a jump of 65, but then the next jump is only a jump of 5. So this scale is not accurate because each grid line is not worth the same amount. That squiggly line is saying we're skipping the first 60 or so people and just jumping right ahead to 65. So there are some graphs that have that squiggly line for various reasons, but this is not an accurate way to display this data. This is a misleading way to display this data. So that's kind of what I've described here. Again, this looks like school B is twice as successful as school A, and that's just not true. If you stretched out that vertical axis, so it was actually going up by 5% every single time, and you got rid of that squiggly line, you would see that school B is not double the height of school A. It's just a little bit higher than it. So this is another way that you can make graphs misleading. Here's a list of all the different types of characteristics of misleading graphs. So you should look for these things whenever you're analyzing a graph in the media or if you're making one yourself. So like the first example, a misleading graph is one where the scale does not start at 0. That's like example 1. Another characteristic of a misleading graph is when there's a gap between 0 and the next value, represented by that squiggly line. So like the example we just saw. Other characteristics would be the scale on the vertical axis does not go up by the same amount each time. So maybe the first jump is by 2, the next jump is by 5, the next jump is by 20. If that's not consistent, that's a misleading graph. Another characteristic could be the bars on a bar graph are not the same width. So some are skinnier than others. That can have a visual effect that changes how you interpret the graph. And there's all sorts of other funny visual tricks that you can do to a graph, like changing the perspective or adding like photos on it. There's all sorts of ways, and some of them are explained in that TED Talk video, of ways to represent information in a purposely misleading way. So the last thing we can talk about is, why would someone create a misleading graph on purpose? If you're looking through a graph in the media, or someone's trying to present an argument and they have a misleading graph, why would they be doing that? There's lots of reasons why. One, it could be if they're a company, they're trying to sell more of their product. This can happen. This would be probably considered false advertising, but the way that a company might be presenting, let's say, survey results, they might be trying to push it more in their favor so that more people will buy their product. So they might want to try to mislead consumers by showing a graph that has some visual tricks to it that work in their favor. If just a regular individual is making a misleading graph, that might be because they're trying to win a specific argument. Company could do that as well, a politician. To dismiss a problem. So maybe someone says, hey, climate change is a problem. And then to dismiss that problem, somebody presents a misleading graph that says, actually, Earth's temperatures are not changing that much if you look at this visually altered graph that I've purposely created in a misleading way. And the last reason someone might create a misleading graph would be to get votes. So it's all kind of the similar idea. You have this goal in mind and you want to mislead people and push them in a certain direction. And you can do that by creating a misleading graph and bending the truth just a little bit. So it's very important that we're able to recognize these so that we don't take information seriously if it's presented in a misleading graph. And it's also important for us to understand, how can we present information in a non-misleading way?